I've hesitated to share this story because some tales linger in the dark corners of your mind, long after the lights are out. This horrifying account of school lockdown. The story where the walls were meant to protect us felt more like cages. Let's begin. But before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. It started like any other Wednesday. We shuffled into our classrooms, chatting about homework and after-school plans. The weather was gray and overcast, typical for our small Midwestern town. None of us suspected that nothing would ever feel normal again by the end of the day. At precisely 11:32 a.m., the principal's voice crackled over the intercom just as the lunch bell rang. Attention students and staff, this is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Please follow protocol immediately. A murmur of confusion swept through the hallways. Lockdowns weren't unheard of, but they were rare. Most of us figured it was a drill, albeit an oddly timed one. Our teacher, Mrs. Carver, quickly ushered us into the classroom, locking the door and covering the windows. She turned off the lights and gestured for us to sit on the floor, pressed against the walls. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "Don't use your phones. This won't take long." The hallway outside felt eerily still. The usual hum of activity had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, they echoed through the corridors. "Is that security?" Ethan whispered next to me. Mrs. Carver pressed her finger to her lips, signaling for silence. But the question lingered in all our minds. Security guards didn't walk like that. The footsteps grew louder and closer. Whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. It moved with unsettling confidence as if it had all the time in the world. And then came the knock, a single hard rap on the door. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats. Mrs. Carver gestured for us to stay still, her face pale. Another knock followed, louder this time. Whoever it was wanted to get in. "Mrs. Carver," a voice called from the other side. It was deep and unfamiliar. "I know you're in there." Her hands trembled as she gripped her phone, silently dialing the school's front office. No one answered. The voice spoke again, more insistent. "You can't hide forever." Mia, sitting a few feet from me, began to quietly cry, her tears glistening in the dim light. Jason reached out to comfort her, but it did little to ease the growing tension. The knock stopped, replaced by the sound of something being dragged along the floor, a metallic scraping noise that set my teeth on edge. It moved past our classroom and down the hall, fading into the distance. For nearly an hour, the lockdown continued. The intercom remained silent, and none of us dared to move. But then a different sound broke the stillness, a phone buzzing. It was Sarah's, one of the quieter students. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening. It was a message from her friend in another classroom. "Are you okay?" "Something's wrong. People are missing." Sarah showed the message to Mrs. Carver, who frowned but didn't reply. She didn't want to risk giving away our position. Moments later, another knock came, this time softer, almost tentative. And then, the voice again. "Sarah, I know you're in there." Sarah's blood ran cold. How did they know her name? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't tell anyone where I was," she whispered. Mrs. Carver motioned us to stay quiet, but the tension was unbearable. The voice on the other side began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that didn't feel human. "You're all so easy to find." And then, the sound of shattering glass. Screams erupted from somewhere down the hall. We clutched each other, our faces pale with terror. The dragging sound returned, closer now. Something scraped against our door, slow and deliberate. Unable to take it anymore, Ethan whispered, "We have to get out of here." Mrs. Carver shook her head. "We stay put until help arrives." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He crawled toward the door, peeking through the small window. What he saw made him recoil in horror. A figure stood in the hallway, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a featureless black mask. In one hand, it held a long metal rod, its end jagged and dripping with something dark. Before Ethan could move away, The figure's head snapped toward him, as if sensing his presence. It tilted its head, then raised a hand to wave. Ethan scrambled back, his face pale. "It saw me," he hissed. The door handle rattled violently, but the lock held. The figure uttered an enraged roar, slamming the rod against the door. Each impact echoed through the room, making us flinch. And then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Mrs. Carver knew we couldn't stay there forever. Whatever was out there wasn't going to give up. She turned to us, her voice barely audible. "We're going to make a run for it. When I say go, head to the emergency exit. Stay together and don't look back." We nodded, fear momentarily replaced by grim determination. Mrs. Carver counted silently, then unlocked the door and flung it open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick and oppressive. We moved quickly, sticking close to the walls. As we rounded a corner, we saw another classroom door ajar. Inside, desks were overturned, and the floor was smeared with red. A single shoe lay abandoned near the door. "Don't stop," Mrs. Carver urged, her voice trembling. We reached the emergency exit, but the door wouldn't budge. It was chained shut from the outside. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. "What do we do now?" Mia cried. Before anyone could answer, the laughter returned, echoing through the halls. The figure emerged from the shadows, its head cocked to one side as if amused by our predicament. "Going somewhere?" it rasped. Mrs. Carver stepped forward, positioning herself between us and the figure. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, holding it like a weapon. "Stay back," she shouted. The figure paused, its head tilting again. Then, without warning, it lunged. Mrs. Carver swung the extinguisher, striking the figure's arm. It staggered but didn't fall. We screamed as the figure raised its metal rod, swinging it wildly. "Run!" Mrs. Carver yelled. We scattered, some heading back down the hall, others searching for another exit. Ethan and Sarah found a janitor's closet and ducked inside, locking the door behind them. I could hear the chaos outside, screams, footsteps, and the sickening sound of metal hitting flesh. When the police arrived hours later, the school was silent. Officers found us huddled in various hiding spots, traumatized but alive. Mrs. Carver's body was discovered near the emergency exit, her hands still clutching the fire extinguisher. Of the figure, there was no sign. The investigation revealed no clues about the intruder's identity or how they had entered the school. Security cameras showed only static during the lockdown. The chains on the emergency exit were equally baffling. No one could explain how they had gotten there. Greystone High reopened weeks later, but things were never the same. Those who had been there that day spoke in hushed tones about the figure, our voices trembling with fear. On particularly quiet days, some of us claimed we could still hear the faint and distant laughter echoing through the halls. That's it for this story. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay safe and remember, sometimes what's lurking in the dark might not be what you think.